Welcome everyone, this is Andres Restart, and this time we are talking about Nintendo Switch 2. And there is a lot to talk about. To be totally honest, I didn't want to make a Switch 2 video today. I had other ideas in mind, but with all the information that's been circulating recently, I decided it was best to talk about this now. On top of the fact that there are some realizations I've had that I think add more perspective to what we're hearing about here, and perhaps may make some of you feel better about some things happening for Switch 2, like backwards compatibility, for example. But it goes beyond that. We're talking about some potential Switch 2 features, specs, reveal timing, release timing, actual titles like the actual Switch 2 lineup. There's a lot to talk about today. So I'd like to get into it, but before we do, let me point out that I am aiming to hit 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so if you do enjoy my content, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. With your help, it's possible. So we're going to be going over different stories and details and rumors here, so again, take this with all a grain of salt. We don't know exactly how the Switch 2 situation is going to shake out, but a lot of this information is coming from credible places, so it's definitely worthy of consideration. But let's now get into what I'll call an appetizer for the different things we're talking about today. And that's related to this new bit of information that Nintendo has added passkey support for Nintendo accounts. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean anything for Switch 2, and let me make that clear right from the get-go, but it might. So basically, on iPads, iPhones, Mac computers, and Android devices, when you're using your Nintendo account, you now have the option to have fingerprint or face recognition as a security measure so someone can't get into your account. And again, this may have nothing to do with Switch 2, but considering the multiple sources that we have that are suggesting there's some sort of camera feature on the Switch 2, maybe Switch 2 could have some of these security features. Considering Nintendo has just only recently added it, it is somewhat peculiar. Moving on to something that's perhaps a bigger deal for most of you, are the specs of the Nintendo Switch 2. Now I'm going to point out that this info is coming from Red Gaming Tech, who supposedly has multiple sources on this. Their video will be linked in the description below, as all the sources mentioned in this video will be linked in the description below, or most of the major ones we haven't discussed before. But to sum what's being said here, because there's a number of different spec things being mentioned, I'll show the imagery here, is that the Switch 2, when docked, will be within 10 to 20% of the Xbox Series S, and when not docked, will be close to the Asus ROG, a high-end handheld gaming PC. And when you factor this info with something that Paul Gale, a friend of ours, said on Twitter recently, which was, a friend that works at a Nintendo third party told me the difference in dev kit excitement / working on Nintendo's X system is night and day to how they approached Nintendo Switch. What this is kind of suggesting is that, one, Switch 2 is going to be closer to current gen platforms than what Switch was when it came out to current gen platforms, but that also it's a lot easier to develop on Switch 2. This basically is giving us a strong hint that third-party games, the big ones, are going to come to Switch 2 a lot more frequently than they did for Switch 1, and they're going to run and look better. We're not going to see as many situations like Hogwarts Legacy or Mortal Kombat 1, where they're being consistently delayed and delayed and delayed beyond the other versions, and are not going to even look or run well. So this is fantastic news. And when you also consider that Nintendo always seems to do a fantastic job with their games regardless of how much power they have under the hood, a system that's basically in the level of current gen platforms is going to be amazing for Nintendo games, and I can't wait to see that. But possibly an even bigger deal is some speculation that's come up from Famiboards that could be telling us when the Switch 2 is going to be revealed, and it might be happening as soon as the end of this October. So this will also be linked in the description below, and this is coming from Paraspiky, and let me just reiterate that this is speculation, but it's informed speculation based off amiibo restocks and the historical precedents of amiibo restocks coinciding with major Nintendo events. And basically what they're seeing here is that a number of amiibo restocks are supposed to come in early November. And when they also take into consideration that the Nintendo Switch 1 was announced in October, shortly before a Nintendo earnings release, the speculation is that before the earnings release, we will get a Switch 2 teaser. And this is where we're going to enter speculation mode and getting into some of my realizations on different things surrounding the Switch 2 situation potentially. Do I actually think Switch 2 can be teased late October, early November, as these amiibo restocks could be hinting at? Actually, yes. I'm not saying I 100% believe it will happen, but I am saying it can happen. There have been multiple people that have come out over the last couple months, that have suggested that a Switch 2 reveal could be happening this year, Jeff Grubb included. And when you also consider in one of Eurogamer's recent reports that Nintendo is keen to release the system as soon as possible, potentially even meaning before the second half of next year, that would suggest that a reveal at the end of this year would make sense, because if Switch 2 comes out, say, May or June, they may want it to be revealed this year. The Nintendo Switch was teased in October, showcased fully in January, and released early March. It was less than a 6-month window. So if Nintendo is planning a first half of 2024 release, it is conceivable for this to happen. But a common counter argument for a Switch 2 reveal in 2023 is that Nintendo would be impacting their holiday sales, so it makes no sense. And this is an argument that I've been making. I just don't think it's likely. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I don't think it's likely. But I had a realization. And the realization is, we've been looking at this wrong. Our perspectives have been skewed. Because the Nintendo Switch is not just a home console. It is also a handheld console. It is a hybrid. And this really matters for this argument. Let me explain why. When the Nintendo Switch was teased in October, a lot of people thought it made a lot of sense because the Wii U was dead. There wasn't really much holiday sales to hurt. Yes, but the Switch wasn't just a successor for the Wii U. It was also a successor for the Nintendo 3DS. The 3DS had games coming out then. They were selling systems then. They supported the 3DS for 2 years after the Switch came out. And if you think about the generational leap from Nintendo 3DS to Switch, it's arguably the biggest leap we've ever seen from one gen to another ever. So this notion that Nintendo wouldn't tease new hardware around the holidays because they wouldn't want to impact sales, well, they did it. They did it with the Nintendo Switch. It should have impacted 3DS sales. And I know to some extent it did, but they still did it. And it's not like Nintendo's the only company that has revealed systems during the holidays. Xbox Series was showcased in December at the Game Awards. Also, apparently, the Nintendo bundles are coming out early October, which is earlier than usual, potentially setting Nintendo up to have sold a lot of things before the tease happens. So basically, I just think it comes down to when Nintendo Switch 2 is coming out. If it is indeed coming out in the first half of 2024, then I do think Nintendo's going to tease it this year. 100%. But if it's not coming out in the first half, then they won't be teasing it this year. I think they'll wait until a little bit later. I've already been on the record. I think that the latest it takes us to hear about official news from Nintendo about Switch 2 is next March. The latest. But then that brings me to another consideration. When is Switch 2 coming out? Well, I have increasing optimism that it's coming out sooner than later. I'm not saying for sure in the first half. I'm not ready to make that commitment. But there is something going on that is giving me this optimism. And that's tied to the Nintendo Direct. The Nintendo Direct, the way it was shown, does kind of really scream to me, hey, we are gearing for Switch 2. And I'm not trying to say there's going to be a gaming drought for Nintendo. No, I think that's maybe where a lot of confusion comes in in terms of these arguments about when Switch 2 is coming out, because I think a lot of people are expecting that there's going to be a drought. I do not think there will be a drought. I think Nintendo's done with droughts. I think that's bad business, and I think where Nintendo's at right now, by unifying their gaming divisions, by having a singular platform, by building up their different studios and buying more, they've positioned themselves to have consistent published quality titles throughout the year, every year, no matter what. But in order to facilitate the transition, what they will do is they'll prioritize their bigger budget development efforts for the next system while relying on a lot of remasters and remakes to fill up the lineup until they come out with that next system. And we look at what's been announced so far for next year, 80% of the Nintendo published titles for next year are either a remaster or a remake. And this year, the ratio is also higher than prior years. Point being, we are in a transition, but like the 3DS, Nintendo continued to come out with games. Nintendo's going to continue to come out with games for Switch. I think that they want Switch to sell for a few more years to come. So even when Switch 2 does come, Switch is still going to be on the market. It's still going to be relevant. So the point is, I do think Switch 2 is coming soon. But something else in the Direct that I found really interesting, and the more and more I think about it, the more interesting it becomes for me, is Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door and it being the last big reveal for the Nintendo Direct. The way the Direct happened, how they had that kind of like sizzle reel at the end where they sort of showcased their lineup from September until sometime next year, it almost felt like they were like, hey, this is the last Nintendo Switch push as the singular platform on the market, and we got other things happening, and then they showed Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. Some part of me thinks that Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door is the first shown off Nintendo Switch 2 title from Nintendo. I am suggesting that Paper Mario: Thousand-Year Door is a cross-gen title. It just has the 2024 timing. It's the only Nintendo title next year that doesn't have some sort of more specified release timing. It's looking to be almost certainly a second half of 2024 release. And when you also consider that they've made this interesting change with Thousand-Year Door, how it's no longer using the GameCube button prompts, but also not using the Switch button prompts, but rather the Super Famicom color button prompts, it makes you wonder why they're doing that. Typically, button prompts in games like this match the system. If Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door is a cross-gen title, maybe that's why this is like this. Some people think this is a stretch. Obviously, it's not confirmed. It could just be an interesting design choice. But I do think it makes even more sense when you consider that if the Switch 2 is an iterative system, that it's basically like a Switch but a better version of it, Nintendo will want to think of ways to really help the system to stand out. That's partially why that when they had an iterative system like the Super Nintendo or the Super Famicom, they used the Super Famicom button colors. That's also in part why with the new Nintendo 3DS, they used the Super Famicom button colors, because they wanted to help it stand out. So with the Nintendo Switch 2, or whatever they actually call it, they may want to use the Super Famicom button colors to help it stand out. So I think this theory is more likely than some people realize. So with that all said, Thousand-Year Door may be a cross-gen title. And if that's the case, where it comes out for both Switch and Switch 2, it may be fitted into the Switch 2 lineup before the end of the year. But if we also factor in that almost certainly a new mainline Pokemon game is coming out next year, and I do believe backwards compatibility is happening, so a Pokemon game will be available for that system, but I'll talk more about that a little bit later into the video. But that also, a lot of information is indicating that Prime 4 is also coming out next year, and it's likely also a cross-gen title given that Nintendo hasn't unveiled it yet. And that 3D Mario is likely the launch day title for Switch 2 or launch window, given what we've heard from Andy Robinson, the owner of Video Games Chronicle, and just the historical precedence of 3D Mario being a big launch title for Nintendo systems, that we're already kind of getting a shaped up lineup of Switch 2 games for next year. Now again, to avoid confusion, the Pokemon game would be for Switch, but through backwards compatibility, I think it'll also be a major release that Switch 2 will take advantage of. But if we're looking at Metroid Prime 4, Paper Mario: Thousand-Year Door, 3D Mario, and a Pokemon release, that's 4 major titles. They're not going to come out in the same month. They're likely all going to each take up their own month, or at least be separated by a few weeks. So with Thousand-Year Door possibly being that one additional game that I think fits into the launch window for Switch 2, it strengthens my belief that Switch 2 is coming out sooner than later because they're going to need space in the year to come out with these different games before the holidays. And the lineup I've brought up isn't a well-balanced lineup. There's probably going to have to be another couple games to offer a bit more variety there. Maybe the F-Zero GX remaster we've heard about is going to be a big multiplayer game in the launch window of Switch 2 before Mario Kart's ready in what I believe is 2025. That may be why Nintendo's put out F-Zero 99 now, to really popularize the F-Zero brand so they can push this GX remaster as a big online multiplayer game to get Switch 2 fans excited. I think it still would come out for Switch 1, but it may also be a big title. But getting back to the point here, I think Switch 2 could be coming out sometime in the summer, if not slightly earlier. So I do think a Switch 2 teaser could happen towards the end of this year. I'm not fully committed to the idea. I'm not 100% saying it's going to happen. I'm not even saying it's a 50% chance. Maybe 30 to 45. I definitely think there's a good chance. And I'm keeping my eyes peeled. But there's also one more thing I want to point out that is just something I kind of realized that makes me believe backwards compatibility is all the more likely. And there's a lot of reasons that I've discussed in the past, because of Pokemon and needing to manage the cycle of those games, and because there's such a large install base of Nintendo Switch owners and they want to facilitate that transition over Switch 2 as much as possible, and also because Nintendo has a history of backwards compatibility whenever they have iterative systems. But another reason why is because we've heard from different sources that there is backwards compatibility. Of course, we heard from some sources that there isn't. And I think the implication there is that there is more than one type of dev kit out there, which makes sense. Some have it, some don't. And what I think some people may not have thought about is that if some of the dev kits have backwards compatibility, that would mean that Nintendo, which by the way, backwards compatibility is not an easy thing to do, it would mean that Nintendo went through the painstaking effort of going through the research and development to get backwards compatibility working for some dev kits, which would be weird if for them to turn around and abandon all of that effort and investment to not have backwards compatibility on the next system. Point being, if some dev kits are showing backwards compatibility, I think that means that the end result, Switch 2 on the market, will have backwards compatibility. But that's all I have for you today regarding leaks, rumors, speculation on Nintendo Switch 2. What do you guys make of this information and some of my points? Let me know in the comments below. This is Andres Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.